David, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you today, man.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, big fan of you and Jason, what you guys have building over there for many years. I think the first time I used Basecamp was 2011. My brother actually started a business in '09 and started using it. So go way back. It's been a long time. I know there's been a lot of iterations there, but I'm really excited to have you on here and chat through some stuff. So appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been going with Basecamp now for 20 years. We just celebrated
Wow.
literally 2 decades. So it's been a good ride.
Yeah. Do y'all reminisce about the early days? Do you guys go back often and kind of think about those?
It's a good benchmark. Absolutely. I think it is very easy for established companies to assume that their velocity or their decision making power or whatever is just grounded in today. We're so fortunate to be able to literally remember what it was like to be four people, to be able to release a product every year with a tiny team. And we often look back upon those early days as an inspiration and as a benchmark for what should be possible. We should be smarter, faster, better now. So there's no damn way the old version of us should be able to outcompete the present version of us
Yeah.
on all these metrics in terms of being able to ship. So it's something we often look back on and benchmark against and make sure that we don't fall into the grooves it's so easy to fall into once you have an established company with many more employees. I think a lot of companies fall into that trap of just believing that whatever is now is what there is.
Yeah.
So that legacy and that remembrance of the early days is really powerful to combat that and push back against it and go like, no, actually, do you know what? This team could just be three people and we could ship this stuff in 2 months.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious how you. Well, actually, where I wanted to start, which is kind of funny, you mentioned the 20-year anniversary. Is you actually said something many years ago around running a business? Is I like to set up a company where I'd like to work at for 20 years, which is a different concept than a lot of people. It's a lot of get in, I want to build the next Instagram and exit and all this stuff. I'm actually curious. Before the setup of the business, like where did that thinking come from? Is that part of your upbringing? Is that some influence you had from an early business or company you're at? I'm just kind of curious where that came from.
Yeah, both Jason and I came of age in the dot-com boom and bust of late 90s, early 2000s. So we saw early on in our careers what happens to companies that are so singularly focused on blow it up big real quick
Mm.
and then get out, and the failure rate of that and the misery really of that for a lot of companies, the vast majority of them that never make it to the unicorn status or whatever else to get that big celebratory exit. And then we also saw the tremendous amount of waste that happens when companies try to pursue that path. And looking at those two things, we went, you know what? It's got to be possible to reach our financial aspirations doing it a different way with far less waste, using our own money, bootstrapping this thing, and then simply living off profits. I was always so surprised in even the early days how difficult it seemed to be for software companies to make money.
Mm.
And you're like, we have no marginal cost. How is it possible you're losing so much money when it literally costs you almost nothing to add an additional customer? Sure, yes, it costs something to create the business in the first place, create the product. But once you have the product, margins should be amazing. And I would look at these companies in the old days and think like, this is just financial malpractice. Now, I understand that it is a path where some companies lose money for literally decades, as Amazon's example, and then flip it around and then they make all the money in the world. But that is such a rare, rare case. And I thought, I don't like those odds. I want better odds at reaching my comparably relatively modest success criterias. In fact, I want the best odds of doing that. And the best odds, as we saw it, was to build the kind of business we could tolerate. Not just tolerate, actually. First, you have to tolerate it, but we could love being in and working on for a really long time because it may take a while.
Yeah.
Very few things are overnight successes. The vast majority of things where people look at it and go like, oh, that looks like an overnight success, there's 10 years of iceberg under that. So if I'm going to dedicate like my entire 20s, perhaps even my 30s to this pursuit, to this company, to this idea, I want it to be somewhere where the path and the journey itself is pleasurable,
Mm.
that I'm not kind of powering through with just sheer willpower, and it's awful all the time, and I'm completely exhausted, and I have no life outside of work. And then 10 years into this endeavor, I land this pot of gold, and then it was sort of all worth it.
Yeah.
Because even with that optimization of trying to get the best odds possible, I knew the odds were long. The odds are long for every business.
Yeah.
The odds are better that you're going to fail than the odds are that you're going to succeed. I didn't want to look back with the kind of regret I saw in others who'd gone through the traditional startup path and not really made it, not gotten that pot of gold at the end, and see them look back upon 5, 7, 10 years of their life and go like, what a damn waste. I wish I had done it differently.
Yeah. Well, and there's really no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, because I mean, I'm seeing this actually right now. It's funny. My uncle just retired from, 40 years working. My dad's about to retire. Now, I don't know what he's going to do. I've been talking to my dad about this, maybe start some consulting. I don't think he'll ever retire. Like, he's one of those like kind of workaholic types, but it's kind of that thing. And you see this a lot of like, build the nice life. And then once you hit 65, oh my gosh, now it's time to party. And it's like, why would you waste those 30, 40 years, right? Do you think, I mean, I'm assuming that's part of the thinking there.
Absolutely. And it's part of refusing to do this deferred living setup,
Yeah.
where we're going to compartmentalize life to such a degree that all the early years, to some extent, for some purposes, the best years, like your most physically, adventurously possible years, that they get dedicated to this one pursuit, and then there's nothing else, and you flip over a switch where you then retire. As you say, lots of people realize, unfortunately, late, but then quite quickly, that they don't have a disposition where they can sit on the beach for even 3 weeks
Mhm.
and do nothing and realize, well, this is it. This is what I put in all the hard work for, that I'm just going to retire to Mojito Island, and I'm just going to enjoy myself doing absolutely nothing but watch beautiful sunsets and sip mojitos. That's not compatible very often with the kind of dispositions of the people who build these businesses.
Yeah.
Most of those kinds of individuals actually get a huge amount of meaning and life joy out of building things, making things, using their capacity. So if you realize that the end nirvana here is not as described, that it's not about getting all out and then doing nothing, then I think it's easier to look at it and go like, okay, I'm going to be working for 40 years, 50 years, maybe in some cases. How do I make sure that duration, the entirety of it, is a good life in all its dimensions, not just like, is the business a success? And I think this is one of the things where perhaps my cultural upbringing made it a little easier. I grew up in Copenhagen, Denmark, and was not surrounded by the constant type A American stereotype of the entrepreneur who just will risk everything all the time for the one pursuit. I saw what a good life could look like, even if you were not even successful in any internet sense of it. Just the pleasures of a simple life. I mean, that sounds like a put down, and it's really the opposite, actually. And I thought, like, why would I give that up? If I'm an entrepreneur and it's going well, why would I want a worse life than someone who has a regular job in Denmark? I think this is one of the things we used to understand better, even in America.
Mhm.
The ideal, or at least the stereotype, sometimes the negative stereotype of an executive in the 60s, 70s, 80s
Mhm.
was of someone who came in at 10, left at 2, went golfing, enjoyed a lot of long lunches with all the kind of goodies of a good life. And then somewhere along the line, I'm not sure whether it was the internet that brought it up, but somewhere in the 90s, it became a new ideal that even if you were at the top of the pyramid, you should be working the hardest. And I mean that in terms of hours spent.
Mhm.
To me, the absolute zenith of this kind of flawed thinking was Marissa Mayer's interview where she bragged about working 120 hours a week
Yeah.
and how that was possible if you were strategic with your bathroom breaks. That's just one of those phrases that have stuck in my mind ever since I read it. And I go, there were freaking slaves in ancient Egypt who had a better setup than you, who were written less hard than you are writing yourself, and you are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You are literally the head of a illustrious organization. How is it possible that we twisted culture in such a way that this is now seen as the ideal?
Yeah.
That you are supposed to be sacrificing literally everything on the altar of these business aspirations. That seems just screwed up to me. It is not how I want to live my life. And that's why Jason and I, from the beginning, had the commitment to a 40-hour work week. That as a moving average, sometimes it was more, and sometimes it was less, but as a moving average, we wanted 40 hours a week. That was a good amount of time, and that was enough. And that's basically how we built and continue to run the company. That is enough, and you can build a wonderful business on that. In fact, I would go so far as to say it is I don't know if it's easier, but it's certainly more sustainable. It's certainly lower risk. It's certainly more compatible with a 20-year career in the same company if you do it that way. Of course, you can push yourself to the max, and plenty of people, specifically in Silicon Valley, do this, and they brag about the, if not 120 hours a week, but then the 80-hour weeks. And you're like, do you know what people look like when they've gone through 2 decades of 80-hour work weeks and the sacrifices in health and family and friends and hobbies? Do you know what those people look like afterwards? I don't think that should be our ideal for the good life or for the quote unquote success.
Yeah.
I think we need a broader definition. At least I'm trying to put out one example. We are trying to put out one example. Here's a software company. It's having a fair amount of impact. We're not the biggest software company. We don't have the most customers in the world, but we do very well. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
And we pair that business success with a different kind of life from the Silicon Valley stereotype, and that at least let it be an option. That, to me, more than anything, is the message that Jason and I have been trying to put out for literally 20 years, is there are multiple paths here. If you want to go full Elon and your goal is to shoot rockets to Mars, okay, great. I love the fact that people like that exist in the world. Wonderful. Is that path like a major path that most people have to disposition to be that kind of person? I don't think so. And we also need just some boring companies that are not shooting rockets to Mars, but just make like email services nicer, project management tools better. That's what we do. It's far more, or it's far less ambitious in that kind of intergalactical sense of it, but it's also necessary for a working economy. And we should have that breadth of like, hey, here's some huge companies run by seriously obsessed people. Wonderful. Great. Applause all day. And here's a very broad section of companies that are run by different types of person who have different types of success criterias. And the mix of it, the mix is good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of good things to take away from what you just said there. The one thing I will say, and this comes back to, I want to make another comment about the relationship stuff in a second, but is constraints. And I think you all talk about this in rework, but is if you, because I find that someone's like, oh, I can just work 70, 80, 90, I'm going to get more done. But what I find is when you talk to those folks more, there's a lot of wasted time in there where it's like, is it really 80 hours? Not really. But if you say, hey, I'm going to work, even if it's like today, hey, I'm going to work 4 hours today. If you're focused and if you can actually time, box pretty well, you can get a shit ton done in that 4 hours that maybe another person, it might take 10. So those constraints there seem very relevant to getting work done in a shorter period of time.
Hugely. I think that is a really good point. We have had a slogan for a very long time called embrace constraints. And that's exactly that. That constraints are not a bad thing. The way forward is not to remove all the constraints that are possible in or that are bearing down upon you. It is to embrace those constraints and go like, okay, so I don't have all the time in the world. I don't have all the money in the world. I don't have all the people in the world. What can I do with the resources that I have? And very often, that's where creativity is. The creativity is within the frame of my constraints. And I love it. I love having the constraints of, as we do with our software development methodology, Shape Up. Generally, we work in 6-hour cycles, and we try to do every feature, any extension to Basecamp or Hey needs to fit within that, which is a relatively short amount of time for major feature development, especially if you're paired with the fact that our working teams are either 2 or 3 people. But that's where we have to come up with better tools that give us more leverage and more productivity. This is how Ruby on Rails, the web development framework that I built that's been used by Shopify and GitHub and a million others, came from. I was one programmer when we started working on Basecamp back in
Mhm.
2004. I did not have the capacity to use the tools that other teams that have dozens of programmers would use. They were simply not productive enough. There was not enough leverage. I had to find something else, a different way to build. And it was in being forced to do that I came up with these kind of different solutions to doing things. And then I also think you're absolutely right. When someone brags about working 80 or 100 or 120 hours a week, they're full of shit. They are full of shit without a doubt. There's no damn way that they have that many creative hours just week after week, month after month, if they are doing any kind of work like this. This is very often I'm working very hard because I sit in a lot of meetings and I give my input, very important input on all of these things. Yeah, you're delusional. You're absolutely delusional. And you're setting a delusional bar that is actually counterproductive. As you say, going from 40 hours a week to 80 hours a week, that sounds numerically as though you're supposed to get twice as much done. No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
In many cases, what happens is you barely get 1x as much done. You will end up, um, if not burned out, then at least exhausted. And if you're in any kind of creative pursuit, whether that's design or programming or writing or whatever, um, it's not the number of hours, it's the quality of the thinking.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons I very early on just not just accept it, but embrace the fact that I really work best, for example, when I get 8.5 hours of sleep. And for me to trade, let's say 1.5 of those hours, instead I go from 8.5 to 7.0,
Mhm.
that's a really bad trade. Like I will lose, I don't know, 10% of my edge for the rest of the day for the working hours that I have. And then I get 1.5 hours left that is of lower quality. That just doesn't seem like a good trade to me at all. So a lot of our thinking, especially in the latest book we wrote, it doesn't have to be crazy at work, focuses on exactly that. Less attention to be spent on the number of hours we work, more attention to be spent on how we use those hours. How do we get rid of the interruptions? How do we get rid of the multitasking? How do we create the space of long hours of uninterrupted time where we can dive really deep and actually solve the hard problems, the ones that move the business forward, the ones where at the end of a week filled with creative challenges like that feels like that was great. That was an awesome week. What I see over and over again is people, and occasionally myself, if I had a really bad week, feeling very busy and Friday afternoon thinking, "Oh man, that was a hectic or even crazy week, but what the hell did I get done? What moved forward? What actually mattered? I did a bunch of things. I talked to a bunch of people, but what did we accomplish?" And what I found time and again, the sense of motivation, especially from creative people, comes from moving the ball forward in meaningful ways. It doesn't come from activity, it doesn't come from motion, it comes from accomplishments. And those accomplishments just come easier when you have long stretches of uninterrupted time where you can dive deep into something, where you don't have like half your brain cycles going off, like, oh, I have a meeting in 45 minutes that I need to mentally be in the space of, and I don't have enough to dive deep on it. That's just a poor trait. So this is one of the reasons why, for example, at 37 Signals, we don't have a shared calendar. There is not an automated way where I can reserve some of Jason's time.
Mm.
I have to have a conversation with Jason. And if we're trying to organize a meeting with 5 people, I have to have a conversation with 4 people individually, one by one, trying to coordinate when that meeting should be. That's a pain in the ass by design. I want it to be difficult
Yeah.
to coordinate meetings with lots of people because meetings with lots of people should be very rare. They should be the last resort, not the first resort. A lot of businesses, a lot of teams work on a meetings first principle of organization. We work on a meetings last principle of organization. Asynchronous communication, lots of written stuff, lots of deliberation where someone can sit back and think for a minute before they respond to something because it's not just flowing past on a conveyor belt of chat, and it's not just in a meeting where someone who just speaks a lot ends up dominating. No, it's optimized for thoughtful, caring, creative people who might take a second to think about a problem and then propose their input into it. And when you have it set up like that, when you end up with a calendar that's actually relatively clear. Like most weeks, my calendar has maybe 2 meetings on it, maybe 3 if I'm really pushing it over the course of a week,
Yeah.
not
Wow.
over the course of a day. When I talk to a lot of other executives at other software companies, it seems like the most important application they have on their computer is their calendar. Now, we make a wonderful calendar at hey.com. I like calendars, but I don't like my calendar full of meetings. And we have worked tirelessly to make sure that it didn't end up that way, because so many companies do. And so many founders and executives end up like that's what they do all day. They sit in meetings, they give their input. And I think that's that's not how I want to live my life. That's not sustainable for me. I would absolutely quit if that ended up being my week, that literally day after day we're just meeting after meeting. That's not what I'm cut out to do.
Yeah. Well, I think I mean, there's a tremendous amount of good insight and advice for folks in there. One of the big takeaways is that this goes back to starting, if you're starting your own business, is you can do it your way. You can look at how other people do it and kind of, if a gut feeling feels right, then do it that way. Even if it's like, this is way against the norm, who cares? It's your business. Like, and that's why and well, it goes back to what you said about the simple life. I think a lot of folks, they put these, what's the best word to use it? Almost these difficulties in their life that are intentionally, they make a decision of like, oh, I'm going to have this type of company. And then all of a sudden they're in meetings 10 hours a day when they actually built the company initially to say, hey, I want to have
Yeah.
flexibility or whatever. And that goes back to like,
Yes.
one of my biggest things, I just learned this recently, and I think you might agree with this, is like life, the best thing about life is relationships and experiences. And they kind of overlap. And it seems like you guys have built that at 37 Signals. Like, you don't just hire thousands of people. You hire people that you really want to work with and you want to build great experiences, both in the company, maybe out. And if you do that, wow, that builds a happy and healthy life where you can get the work done in 40 hours. Like, it all has this nice kind of cyclical part to it. So I'm imagining that was the structure from the beginning, that y'all just said, this is our values and we're just sticking with it.
Yes, we started very intentionally from first principles. First principles of how to organize the business, how to organize our products, how to organize our teams and our collaboration, and our communication style, all of these things. Because both Jason and I had worked for other people, thankfully. I think this is one of the most important ways for entrepreneurs to learn how to run a good business, is to work for someone else, preferably someone who's a quote unquote bad boss. I think you learn uh, nothing as fast as when you have a negative experience in the organizational realm. It kind of just sears into your brain that was, ugh, no, I didn't like that. If I had the power, I would make things differently. I think it makes you far more empathetic to the employee side of the view. If you end up being that boss, hopefully you have some of those bad boss memories that can remind you whenever you're being glib or a little too rash in your decision making. You go like, what would that have felt like if I had sat in the other side of the table here? So I think that's really powerful. And I think we took it perhaps further than most, because I thought it's interesting. Like, every company is a petri dish where you can run these experiments. Oh, I wonder what happens if, for example, we only work 4-day weeks over the summer. That's really interesting. Do we lose 20% of productivity? Do we lose 5% of it? I don't know. Let's try. Let's see what happens. And that degree of independence and autonomy is, to me, the most valuable aspect of being a founder, of running your own business. Unfortunately, a lot of founders end up selling that autonomy and that independence quite early on to investors, to other people that they then feel they have an obligation to act in a certain way, often against their um, idea of what would be best, because, well, we've taken the money, we're supposed to hit these milestones in this amount of time and so forth. And it becomes quite quickly oppressive is a big word, but pressure filled environment that makes it feel like it's impossible to do things differently. Make it feel like there's a playbook and you're supposed to follow it, because that's how we're going to get to the next stage or the next round or whatever. There is no greater gift than knowing that playbook is optional, often wrong, often exactly the opposite of what you should be doing at your size, or doesn't fit into your context, or doesn't fit your personality type. Um, that to me should really be something you embrace as a founder. Hey, uh, I'm doing this. I'm starting it. I'm running it because I actually do believe I have some degree of, either you can call it self confidence or you can call it arrogance. I do believe I know better.
Yeah.
If you don't believe you know better in any realms, you should not be a founder. You should have some degree of confidence that you have better ideas about how to do things. Otherwise, why are you in charge? Let someone else who have better ideas be in charge. So I think that kind of goes with the territory. I don't think most founders are actually lacking that much in that degree of self confidence, but they don't always express it in their actions and in their choices.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a tragedy. So often, when we hear from people who've read Rework in particular, what we hear is a gratitude for expressing what they already believe to be true. It's not that we actually told them necessarily something new, it's that we gave them permission to trust their own fingers.
Mm.
We gave them permission to trust their own instincts about how to organize the business. Oh, I already also thought that you're supposed to do it this way. I also don't really like meetings, for example, but I thought that's just the way you're supposed to do it. I thought everyone else, da da da. So just having one example sometimes is all you need to gain that confidence that your ideas are actually good, and that if you're running a business, you should run them to the best of your knowledge as you know it, not trying so hard to comply with the playbook, the investors, the expectations. And when you do that, it becomes far easier to imagine going 20 years.
Mm.
I find it very difficult to imagine. I mean, actually, I find it impossible these days to imagine working for someone else again.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that is what drives a lot of entrepreneurs, this feeling that, like, I don't want to work for someone else. And then unfortunately, they end up working for someone else through
Right.
expectations, through the playbook, through the investor pressure. And that is the most sacred to me. This ability to make decisions that no one else would give you permission to do.
Yeah. I love that. Well, and that actually may be a good transition to, I wanted to talk more about like the product and building a little bit, because I see this from an investor. I've been to some startups and companies that have been backed by like private equity and stuff. And it seems like, they're maybe trying to push out the latest, greatest feature that can sell the product, but it maybe doesn't even help the customer. And there's a lot of disconnect there. So you're kind of being pushed. So I'm curious, and maybe a good place to start, because you actually mentioned this recently, and how this goes into you all thinking about the product. You mentioned Blue Ocean Strategy, one of your favorite business books. Can you share a little bit about that book and why you all use that as kind of a starting point for a lot of your product decisions?
Yes. So Blue Ocean Strategy is one of those really rare business books I find where I enjoyed reading the whole thing. Most business books, I feel like, contain maybe three good ideas that could have been a handful of blog posts or essays, and then they're simply stretched over 300
Yeah.
pages. Blue Ocean Strategy teaches you how to look at markets in a differentiated way. And I mean that in the sense that any product or service is a collection of different parameters or different aspects of the business. And the naive entrepreneur goes in and thinks, I'm going to be the best at everything. We're going to be the best company at everything. And Blue Ocean Strategy says that's unrealistic. You're not going to beat everyone at everything. You have to choose. You have to specifically, and this is the counterintuitive part, you have to choose what you're going to suck at.
Mm.
You have to choose what you're not going to be good at, what you're not optimized for, where you're not going to beat the competition. Because only by choosing in that negative space are you going to create enough room to be extra good at some of the other things. If you go like, we're just going to be, we're going to be best price, best features, best this, that, and the other thing, usually whoever has the most money wins, and you're not the one with the most money. If you're starting a new business, almost by guarantee, there's someone else who's already adjacent to your space or right in your space, who already has more money, more people, more customers, more everything. And you're showing up to compete with them with far less. So you have to be very diligent in choosing where you're going to be better and finding those openings in the market. And Blue Ocean Strategy positions it as the red ocean is full on competition. We're competing, for example, on price.
Mm.
Um, Very difficult to make headways, very difficult to win things. And when you do win things, oftentimes it's only for a brief moment, because then you're outcompeted by someone else in that blue or red ocean. Versus the blue ocean, you're alone to some degree. Like, that's the ideal. The ideal is to be alone, because your specific package has just enough twists and turns that most customers don't see direct competition to it.
Mm.
That's the space we were in, particularly with Basecamp, for a really long time. There are many solutions out there where you can track to-do lists. There are many ways that you can send long-form emails, for example. There's many ways you can upload files. What Basecamp did in the early days was to take all of these things, and it wasn't the best at any of it. Basecamp was never the best file sharing platform or the best to-do tracking platform, but it was the best integrated solution. And a lot of customers found they didn't actually care about these trite things like best of breed file sharing.
Yeah.
They didn't have those niche, right at the edge demands that required literally the best of that. What they had was a need for a full solution where nothing would fall through the gaps, where everything was just in one place. That was more important. That was a classic example of the success of a blue ocean strategy.
Mm-hmm.
That we had picked the integration between a select number of pieces that we believed most companies and teams would need to create progress, and just made something really nice within that. And we got to have that market to ourselves for a really long time.
Yeah.
Now we don't anymore. It has turned more red ocean. We have far more competitors now. But for a really long time, we got to swim in that beautiful blue ocean by ourselves, which also meant blue ocean margins. That's really the crux of this.
Yeah.
When you are not competing just on price with someone, you have so much more margin power, which means you can have a completely outside success with a relatively small company. I mean, we didn't have many employees when we were doing tens of millions in revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, in the US, you don't have to disclose that. So we got to live in this almost slightly hidden, nested away blue ocean pond that none of the other larger predators really ever discovered, because it was just off the map. And that is the ideal. But Blue Ocean strategy just really takes you through that process. They use a bunch of case studies showing, like, hey, here's a fitness outfit. I forget what it was called. There's something that specifically targeted women, where instead of just exercising individually by yourself, they put the machines in a circle. And I thought, like, wow, I would never have thought of that. But there's some insight here that takes something as Red Ocean, as gym membership,
Mm-hmm.
and then go, well, we can do that, but if we actually just change the direction of the machines and make it a single sex space, or at least have classes that are that, boom, there's a blue ocean. There's now access to a customer group who weren't interested in the hyper fitness, individualized, traditional model. And we can find tremendous customer success there. And even more than just a success for the company, it's also really just fulfilling a need that, let's take that example. Some women perhaps wouldn't have gone exercising at a traditional place. All of a sudden, they're doing that. That is the ideal to me of capitalism. You fulfill a need that wasn't being fulfilled otherwise. People are happy to pay you for it. You actually increase overall wealth, both for yourself, but also for your customers. And that beauty comes out of a blue ocean analysis.
Mm. How do you think then about, because there's a lot actually, and this is top of mind, not just from a lot of folks I get to talk with. My brother, actually, I was mentioning him earlier, but he actually, and I give him credit, like, he learned how to program 3 years ago, just picked it up, and he built his own product for the dog training industry. His wife's a behavior consultant in the industry. And I say that to say, actually, him and I were talking in prep for this. I was like, hey, what are you going through? What are some things you might consider? And he was like, well, I'm having an issue right now with, like, the feature creep, the product strategy, because people are asking for different things. Like, how do you know what to prioritize, what not to prioritize? How do you all think about that? And maybe it's different now than it was 20 years ago, but I'm just kind of curious your thought process.
That's a great question. I think this is one area where it is easy to go astray, because on the one hand, we all like to say and think, and there's truth to it, that the customer is quote unquote right. But they're right about their problems. They're right about their struggles. They're not right about their solutions. Very often you will get feedback from a customer and it will come in the form of a solution. It'll come in the form of, can you just add this one feature?
Yeah.
And that's just them being an amateur product designer. They're not buying your product because you have a bunch of amateur product designers. They're buying your product because you were better at articulating their problems in the shape of software. And you have to remember that that's your job. Your job is to take uh, problems, often ill articulated problems, zoom out and realize what are the generic aspects of that problem. In which way is that problem the same problem as this person over here and this person over there and that person over there have, even though they're articulating them individually as these specific features that don't seem like they have anything to do with each other, but they actually really do. And once you do that zoom out, you realize, okay, it's my job to take, let's say, 1,000 problems and turn it into 5 features. If you take 1,000 feature suggestions and turn it into a product, you will have a shit product. You will have a mess of a product that doesn't have any direction. It doesn't have any coherence. It just have a bunch of patches that were put on by individuals narrowly thinking about their problems. You can't create software for a mass market like that. You have to create software on behalf of people, not on their request.
Hmm.
It has to be on their behalf. And that's sometimes difficult when you get an enthusiastic customer, especially if you're dealing with enterprise sales where each account really matters quite a lot and you want to land that account and they say, well, we can only buy your software if you add these 3 features. And you see the result of that all over the place. One of my favorite examples is looking at Slack. So we released a install it yourself Slack alternative a few months back under the brand of once.com called Campfire, where we were trying to what's the epicenter of chat? It's not actually a difficult problem anymore. It's certainly a solved problem. There's just a stereotype to it. And we went through and looked on modern day Slack. And you can see exactly what I talk about if you go to the preference settings of Slack. There's literally, it seems, hundreds of obscure individualized features. And in each of those checkboxes, in each of those drop downs that seem like, where the hell did this come from? I can see the enterprise sales contract. I can see the salesperson going like, we're only going to land this big account that we need if you put this stuff in there. And I think this is to me, one of the great blessings of running or selling to small and medium-sized businesses rather than selling to the enterprise is that you usually have a larger customer base. You don't have just a handful of individual customers who can twist your arm and twist the product in their direction. You are basically obliged to keep it quite generic. We have about 100,000 customers. If we lose any one individual customer, at most, we will lose about $300 a month. That's where we cap the individual customer. Now, I'm also an investor in other companies that deal with enterprise sales, and I see those pressures and I go, you really have to be mindful of them. It's not always within your purview to fully fight back. Certainly in the early days, sometimes you do have to make some compromises and twist your product to some degree to make that sale, but you got to know that that's what you're doing. You have to be honest with yourself that oh, okay, this is a concession. Hopefully let's get to a place where the business no longer needs to offer those concessions, because as we do, we might be optimizing the product for the individual customer right in front of us, but we're actually narrowing the other potential customers who don't have a say in this debate because they're not even in the conversation. I think this is one of the chief responsibilities of a founder, is to listen. And it's hard to do because they don't speak, but to metaphorically listen to all the customers you haven't talked to yet. You will hear from all your actual customers.
Yeah.
You will hear from all your leads, and they will be telling, I need this, I need that. And as you say, feature creep is the natural state that comes out of that conversation. You have to think like, okay, here's one customer in front of me. They have a problem. It'd be nice if we could solve it. But if solving that problem kind of takes us off track, what does it do to the potential 10,000 customers, 100,000 customers, or a million customers? We're not going to land anymore because they're going to think, oh, this is not for me anymore. This is for the construction industry or something, because you have a feature now that's specifically just for them.
Mm.
And I think early on with Basecamp, we really realized this because we had built Basecamp initially for ourselves, for creative consulting companies. And we realized, oh, there's a bunch of customers showing up here that's nothing like that. Oh, here's a church. Here's a school. Here's a software company. Here's a product company. Oh, that doesn't really fit that. How do we make sure that we retain that, right? Like, how do we not narrow our product in such a way that the school or the church go like, oh, this is something for architects, I guess. Like, Basecamp is not for us. It's quite difficult, but it starts with accepting you're designing products on someone's behalf. You have to listen to their problems, not their prescriptions, not their specified solutions, and that you have to keep all the potential customers in your head as recipients here. Am I making the product broader, or am I making it more narrow?
Hmm. Yeah, well, it even goes back to what you mentioned about the blue ocean strategy. It's like, what do you suck at? Like, so you can't do everything. So sometimes you
Exactly.
have to put those guardrails. And I remember this. I've been in
And
software sales for a lot of years. Like you'll have customers that say like, "Oh, hey, can you do this?" And like for some reason, from a sales side, folks don't want to say, "No, we don't," but have you considered? Because sometimes they don't think about the way around the problem. They're only thinking about the problem. And I think that's from a development standpoint, probably is like, no, you're thinking about different ways. They don't care how it's solved. They just want it solved. You may have a unique way that they haven't even considered, right?
yes, that's a huge part of it. But I think the harder part and just as important part is to sometimes say no. This is not the right fit.
Hmm.
This sale should not go through. Or, which is sometimes even harder, you have to, well, I find it's easier to follow what I'm talking about if you're willing to let a customer go.
Hmm.
Sometimes a customer will sign up for your product. It'll be a great fit for them for 2 years. And then suddenly their business changes, they become much larger and they're no longer within sort of the mark for what you're trying to solve. And they will try to pull you with them.
Yeah.
They will try to say, like, now we have these problem and that problem and so on. Could you really quick? Can you No, you can't. Sometimes it's, do you know what? Congratulations. You have graduated from our product and you should now talk to some enterprise salesperson at another shop.
Yeah.
That's really difficult to do, especially if a lot of your business hinges on a single customer. But I think it's key if you want to retain the integrity of a vision of something that is simple to use and pure and so on. This is often what we battle specifically for Basecamp. I know the number one reason we hear over and over again. Why did you choose Basecamp? Oh, it was really simple. I could get my entire team on it without any tutoring, without any setup or learning. It was really simple. That's a really diffuse yet highly important value. Like, what do you do with that? Well, you have to keep it in mind every single time someone asks for a new feature.
Mhm.
If I add this, how much of it's really simple, I could get the whole team on Basecamp without having to have seminars about it, do I chip away at? And what usually happens is you chip away a little bit. It's kind of like the parable of the split pea soup. So, say you're a big manufacturer of split pea soup, and I don't know even what the metrics are, but 100 peas go into that soup, right?
Mhm.
And you go like, do you know what? If we took out 2 peas, we could save 2% on our pea
Mhm.
supply chain. No one's gonna notice. No one's gonna notice 2 peas missing. So you take out 2 peas, and right, no one noticed. So next time or next year, you take out another 2 peas, and you keep on doing this, and all of a sudden, there's not a lot of peas left in your split pea soup, and your sales are crashing. And why? Why don't people like our soup anymore? Yeah, because you kept just taking out the 2 peas. So this is something I find that original founders have an easier time doing. They have an easier time saying no and being the guardians of a vision that, like, no, we're not going to fuck with the peas. You can optimize all sorts of other things. You do not get to take any of the peas out of the soup because then it's no longer going to be the soup. And the same way, we're not just going to keep adding these features. Yes, maybe it's going to make your sale better, but I know that if we keep doing that, in 3 years' time, we will have said yes to 375 things. And no longer will anyone be describing Basecamp as, oh, it's super easy to use. It was so quick to get our whole team online. I love it. They'll be saying other things. Or actually, no, they won't be saying anything at all. They just won't be signing up. And you'll go like, what happened?
Yeah. Well, you all did something, and I don't know if you're the first to do this, but definitely I haven't seen it a lot. And I think it was, fact check me on this since you know it. It's either going from Basecamp to Basecamp 2 or Basecamp 2 to Basecamp 3, where you actually had both running at the same time. Because I remember I was using it at the time, but instead of like, no, we're just adding these new features and you have to use it, you gave folks a choice. I thought that was really unique. How did you even come to that decision to go that route?
That's a Great setup, and something I'm really proud of us doing because, as you say, it's very uncommon. Today, we have three versions of Basecamp. We have the original version of Basecamp that was created in 2004, and then we developed until 2010. That version has not received any new features since 2010, has not received anything but some performance and security fixes, yet we have kept it around for now 14 years after we stopped making that development. And to this day, it is still a multi-million-dollar SaaS business that has thousands of very happy customers who are not in the market to uproot everything around their workflows that are optimized for that version of Basecamp. And that was exactly the thinking. A lot of SaaS software is sold on the premise that it gets upgraded and customers go like, oh, that's great. So I'll get a new feature tomorrow that I didn't have today. Sign me up. Well, they're happy when they see that. They're less happy when you move things around.
Right.
When you change some features, perhaps, God forbid, you drop some features, or you come up with a better idea of how to organize the central premise of the product. And that's what happened with Basecamp. After we had developed the original version for 6 years, we had fundamentally new ideas for how a great project management tool should be designed, should be created, and it wasn't compatible. If we were going to take all those new ideas and shove them down the throat of existing customers who love the old version, there were going to be a lot of people who would be very unhappy. And it happens all the time in SaaS. In fact, and now I use the Slack example. Slack rolled out a redesign, I think, a few months back. And universally, what I heard was not like, oh, great new features. It was like, why? Why did you move the cheese? Why did you change this around? This is really annoying. And software developers and designers in particular are very glib to dismiss that. Well, you just need to get used to it. Like, this is so much better. Like, the proportions here are better. And like, customers just don't care. Oftentimes, they're just not in the market for a change. And you're taking that choice to be in the market for a change away from them. And they don't like it. Of course, they don't like it. They had something they liked, and you now gave them something new that you believe to be better, but they were like, well, I didn't ask for it. So that's what we did with Basecamp. We built a whole new version of the software that was materially different, that we could never, in good faith or with good relations to existing customers, have transitioned from. And this is the other thing. Oftentimes, and I'll use a different example here than Slack, Gmail. So Gmail comes out in 2004. What a revolution, right? A gig of space, quickly become the market leader in email. To this day, I think they have 1.5 billion users or something. There's no room left to innovate. You cannot move even one button, even 2 pixels, without literally 100 million people going like, what? You're ruining my day. I can't find the thing anymore. So it just ossifies. And now the Gmail you have today is going to be the Gmail we have until the end of time. They can't materially change it without upsetting literally 1 billion people. So what's in between that? On the one hand, you have stasis. And on the other hand, you have very unhappy customers because you move things around. Well, a third option is to create a new version. This is how software used to work. If you did not like Photoshop 4 because you were really happy about Photoshop 3, you could have kept Photoshop 3 installed on your machine. That doesn't work in SaaS land most of the time. But we made it work in SaaS land. And to this day, we actually have 3 versions. We have the original version, we have Basecamp 2, and then we even have what we now call Basecamp 4, which that last version did transition from 3 to 4 because the ideas weren't that different. But we have 3 distinct code bases with distinct customer sets. And each version is a multi-million-dollar business in itself, even though they're all called Basecamp, but they're compartmentalized. They're quite different. We have tools to move from one to another. So if you're running Basecamp 2 and you want to run the latest version, you can. A lot of customers don't want to do that. And people go like, well, that sounds so complicated. It sounds like, how can you even maintain that? What do you mean, how can you maintain that? That original version of Basecamp is the most profitable product we have in our entire portfolio. We have literally not changed a line of feature code in 15 years. We have to tend to some security updates occasionally. We sometimes have to move it on infrastructure, but the margins on that product's got to be like 97%.
Wow.
That's, I mean, we should all be so lucky.
Yeah.
We should all be so lucky to have parts of our product portfolio with like 97% margins, right? So it's okay that there's a bit of expenses to it. I also think there's a broader point that we've incorporated into our brand, which is we're not going to be Google. We're not going to be, what is it called? Killedbygoogle.com, the Google graveyard, where you can see a list of, I think, 500 different services that have been killed.
Oh, wow.
Most recently, they added Google domains to that list. They killed the actual piece of innovation they had for Gmail years back with the inbox product. A lot of people really don't like that, and they want to have an alternative to the constant churn. Because when you buy into a SaaS solution, you're kind of handing a lot of trust to your data and your access to a company, and then just praying, hoping that that software sticks around, because you can't run it yourself. If Google tomorrow decided, oh, actually, email's dead, you should all be running something else, so we're going to shut down Gmail. What are you going to do? That would really suck for a lot of people. Suddenly they're forced to be evicted. Really, that's what it is. You're getting data evicted. Now you got to pack up all your shit and find an alternative and move it all over. Huge hassle, right? So we wanted to be something else, and we incorporated that in a saying we have for our heritage products, as I like to call them, not legacy products. Legacy sounds like something back. Heritage, no, that's what
Like the
uh, late 60s 911 air-cooled Porsche is. That's a heritage car. Porsche is very proud of the fact that they have a history, they have a heritage, and that customers are still able to drive those machines around. Same thing with a Leica M3 from the 50s or a Rolex from the 70s. Like, there are companies who've built their entire brands around this idea of heritage. Very few of them are in software. I think Microsoft, to some degree, like I think you can still run a Windows 95 program on a modern version of Windows. That's very rare. Most software companies, especially the SaaS ones, are all about now and next. And I think that, you know what, there should be some space here for heritage. So we have a suite of heritage products where we've committed to maintaining them until the end of the internet, or someone else turns off the lights. In terms of customers, the last one turns off the lights. And I think in this marketplace, that is a very blue ocean approach that a customer signing up for hey.com today can know we're not just going to get bored in like 6 months and pivot. Pivot is one of those words that sounds really cool to an entrepreneur and sounds like absolute hell to a customer.
Yeah, I mean, I love everything y'all are doing, and I have for a long time. I could probably talk for you hours here. I want to be respectful of your time. Let's end on this. I'm just kind of curious before I let you out of here, kind of give you the floor. Someone that's starting today, they're starting a business. Maybe they're doing a side hustle. They've already started, but they're trying to kind of do it full time. Any advice, a question you'd have them ask themselves? Maybe it's a challenge to them. Anything you would leave kind of as a lasting note of our conversation?
A few things. There's no room just for the idea person. So if you're trying to get something off the ground and you don't have money, and you don't have skills, you got to acquire one or the other. Either you got to get a bunch of money, and you're not probably going to get it from other people if all you have is an idea, or more achievable, you have to acquire some skills. You have to become a programmer, like the person you mentioned who learned how to become a programmer 3 years ago, such that they could build something by themselves. That's a path that's very available. I mean, it's been a bit of a joke under the learn to code
Right.
idea, still very much there. And the advances in AI has made it a lot easier. Not that AI yet, at least, is going to write the software for you, but they're going to make it much easier to get up to speed and actually learn this stuff yourself. So learning the skills yourself and then embracing those constraints to build something you can build with a single individual. First of all, pick a tool chain, a tool set that's compatible with that. Don't just go like, oh, what is Facebook or Meta using? What is a huge company using? What is Google using? I should be using that. No, you shouldn't. They're designing their tool chains for companies like them who have teams of 20 to 100 to 1,000 working on things, and they need very specific tools for that. You need something that a single individual can be productive with. Now, that's, of course, part of my life mission with Ruby on Rails. That's why I continue to be so interested in building and pushing that forward. I want to make sure we retain a one-person framework. where a single individual with a good idea and an interest in learning some skills can actually make something happen, can actually build a whole product. And then if it goes well, they can hire more people and it can become bigger and whatever. But the first hard step is getting over the wall of getting something out there. So doing that, then reading Blue Ocean Strategy, finding your niche, doubling down on what I'm going to suck at, what are we not going to be good at, and then building an audience. I mean, this is one of the things that used to be more novel to say. Now it's all been rolled up into content marketing, a term that absolutely just want to make me barf. I hate that. But the idea that you are sharing, and we can summarize that as our marketing strategy basically since day one have been to outshare, to outteach rather than outspend. If you're going into markets that do have other competitors, you're not going to buy more ads than they are going to buy. You have to have something else. You have to have a story, you have to have an angle, you have to have a voice. And you already do. If you're the kind of person who's going to start something from scratch, you already do. You just have to find it, refine it, and then use it. Yeah, those are my ideas.
That's a great way to end the conversation, David. I appreciate you being on and sharing all this. And thanks again for your time.
Thanks for having me.